Hi, I'm Chris from Airwindows, and I have a little surprise for you today. It's something a little bit like this plugin here. You might remember it. It's called DeRez, and I can do this. Or a little bit crushing. Also, notice something that the original DeRez has always had. See the top of the frequency spectrum here? When we bit smash with DeRez, it does a thing where rather than just making square waves out of the output, it is interpolating slightly between the edges of the samples for a more analog kind of style, causing it to have a roll-off. And this continues to be the case even at very high frequencies that do all kinds of crazy things to the audio. But wait, there's more. Introducing DeRez2. As you can see, this has a bunch of more stuff going on with it, and I'll explain exactly what that is. Firstly, let's demonstrate it going. You can see that leaving these other things at their defaults of 1, actually, hang on a second. I'll be wanting to remove the original DeRez because DeRez2 at full crank doesn't sound like that, but you see that it can do the same thing, and you can see that it can do the bit crush, but there is something new going on. This hard control, and this one has dry wet because something that the hard control does lets you do an interesting trick with the dry wet that wouldn't have been as good with the original DeRez. Firstly, if you sort of sneak it in the middle of things, you'll get a peculiar effect. It's really meant to be like 0 or 1, and it interacts with things. But watch what's happening with the rate control. The hard control interacts with the rate control in a different way. When I'm using this hard control on full softness, what it's going to do is look at the last sample before it changes position. And rather than doing an interpolated sample, when it reaches these points of transition, it's going to look for the last sample that didn't get all the way over to the new position and bleed in a little bit of dry signal. So effectively what this does is it takes DeRezing at high frequencies and modulates those interpolation places. Well, why don't I just show you? Let me compare this to full hard. And back over to soft. What this gives us is a way of doing sample crushing And remember, both this and the original DeRez are using essentially analog bit crushing and sample crushing. There's no fixed point between bit crushes. Instead, it is applying them gradually. And, well, you can hear it quite plainly. You can kind of dial it in as you see fit. But this is giving a sort of airier effect than this. We have the full dry signal. Then as we start doing a little bit of sample crushing, it's giving this sort of subtle effect that's meant to be kind of like old digital hardware, although this is not the way that old digital hardware does it. But this is bringing in some of the dry signal at transition points between the sample rate crushes so that it makes the transition a little gentler and suggests at old school digital while still giving a kind of analog-y quality to it compared to the raw digital form, which is what the previous DeRez had. That, as good as it is, still sounds like a DAW effect. Whereas this one more closely resembles some kind of old hardware. But wait, there's more. I haven't touched the res yet. Here's something that the res does, and this is why it takes effect when you are putting hard in the middle there, is because of the way it interacts with the res. Here's what this does. Here how we've got just complete overload here. Hard bleeds in EULA. I'll show you. What that does is it's going to bit crush rather than being in individual places like this. We start bit crushing in a way that corresponds to EULA. There's more positions to quantize to in here because of what EULA does. And then it un-EULAs on the way out, which is why setting it part way through has strange effects on things. But you can hear we have a very severely bit crushed effect here, but that's nothing compared to linear bit crush, which is obliterated. And of course we can rate shift it as well. So as you can see, we can still do all the craziness of DeRez, although with the dry wet now as well. But here's the thing. If you're using the hard control on full softness, so you're doing EULA on the internal bit crush, and it is also taking its effect on the rate control, so it's letting through samples that are dry samples between these. It's like taking the opportunities between rate crushed stuff and bleeding through just a little bit more control over the waveform. We get to closely mimic whatever old school sampling device you want in sort of broad strokes, because it's not really about carefully modeling every component in the thing. It's about getting it so that it's talking to you the way that the old school gear could. And I will demonstrate that now, and then I'll throw the hard control back on full hard, and you can hear what that sounds like. But let's skip over to a sound like, I don't know, the drum track maybe. Firstly, let us bring res up a little bit so it doesn't sound quite as obliterated, because this, like, full hard is completely over the top. We can bring this up a little bit. Now this is full clean, and this is partly dirty. We can probably go a little bit dirtier than that. Also, remember with DeRez, we can throw a little tiny bit of DC offset in there, which let's just take a moment to do that. That's a trick for bit crushers in general, and it still works with DeRez2. You just have to be much more subtle about it. We're calling it DC voltage, and I'm going to be doing the option thing to make tiny corrections with that. But like I said, we can use this to gate it just a tiny bit. And having done that, let's bring the res back up again. And then let's bring the rate down. Bring the res up a little tiny bit maybe. And pull this back a touch. Now that's a pretty decent, extremely clean, old school digital sampley kind of effect. It's stepping on the highs a little bit, and it's stepping on the rate more than a little bit. The resolution could be a little rougher, like if we want it real 12-bitty. We can go there. And then, of course, if we compare it with dry-wet, that's nice and clean for this sample anyhow, whereas the other one is like this. Complete change in texture through just a couple of controls without doing anything that drastic. Between this and this. So we can really reshape that, but leave it very dynamic. It's not full of grunge, it's just completely changed the texture. But here's one final detail. The way that DeRez2 is doing this is it's looking for the previous sample for these transition points. And dry is not the previous sample, dry is the active sample. And the rate control, when used at a setting like above about 0.5, it's a very fast rate indeed. This is throwing in those driest samples rather a lot. That means if we use dry-wet to go to partly dry and partly wet, we're not only doing the dry sample coming in through here, but we're also averaging it with the dry signal. And then bleeding a little bit of dry in as well. So what that's going to do is drastically color the high frequencies off of our track and darkened them in a very specific way that's basically a 2-sample average on just the stuff that is between the quantization points. So what you'll hear with that is a super dark old school sound that gets to use more of the dry signal and gets to be cleaner than even the very sophisticated DeRez2 sound, and I'll demonstrate that now. Here's dry. I'm going to wait until we start playing the cymbals here. I think that's coming up. If it's not, then I can... There we go. Now, part ways. How do you like that? So with this, we get a kind of semi-bit crushed, semi-clean, specially darkened, but as you can see, it's still going right to the top of the waveform quite neatly. And we can even turn off the DC voltage to allow the derezzing to kind of bring up detail the way that it will do if you don't offset it a tiny amount. And we'll coarsen it a little bit. Voila. And that's compared to this perfectly ordinary raw signal. An interesting thing you'll notice is that the highs here, since this is a directly sampled mic'd recording, and it's actually a modified rig using, if I'm not mistaken, Airwindows modified SM57s, so this doesn't go all the way out to the maximum sampling rate when I'm playing cymbals and things like that. But you'll notice when I start derezzing it, it is filling in that missing information with bitcrushed and weird stuff without exaggerating any of it. And I can go to full wet, we still get that effect. But I can also sneak a little bit of it in there. See, it's just softening it a little tiny bit. And we'll use the res to add a sort of compressy type thing going on, because the lowest level of the bit crush is flickering back and forth between two positions, so it's acting like it's a little bit of a New York compression. And then let's just bring a little more of that in. A little darker. How's that grab you? So, we can do that with all manner of stuff like this. This is what it sounds like using that setting on a more full range track with bass and stuff going on. So DeRez2 is effectively free. If you are poor and starving and need money for food and stuff like that, then by all means use it. If you're like in the hood somewhere and you can't throw money at people for plugins and stuff, this is for you. You should be able to dial in whatever kind of old school sampler or less old school sampler, like for instance, that's a little bit more modern sounding. But it's still, like, that is raw. And we can still get a sampley sound out of it as well. On the other hand, if you have money to spend on plugins or just want to keep me doing this kind of thing, because this is DeRez2. That means I'm still working on this stuff, and I keep coming up with new things to do. I think you'll find that this new thing was worth doing. I didn't tell anybody I was doing it, but on the whole, I think that this checks out. I think it's going to give you what you want as far as classy, old school digital vibe. You just got to dial it in. And again, I suggest using full hard on that. I'll show you what happens when you dial away from that. You could even automate this if you wanted to play with it. You can take it and go rawr. And this is a combination of changing the way that dry stuff comes in and messing with the way that ULaw is affecting things. So this is a whole extra set. You can have stuff in the middle of this and just sort of throw it in there in the middle of stuff as an effect. Again, I recommend it being on full soft, but I let you have control of it so you can do stuff like this. That might be fun at some mix somewhere. I bet you can find uses for that. So, if you can afford to buy a plugin, pretend that this is worth $50. I mean, maybe it's worth more than that if it really nails the sounds that it's trying to get. But let's pretend that it's worth $50. And pretend that you're buying it from me like a commercial product. And in exchange for that, you get lifetime support, like my lifetime, not yours. If I die, then you're kind of on your own. You know, hopefully the internet will help you. But also the source code and license for using it on all of your computers and ability to back it up and all that kind of stuff. That if you were buying it as a commercial product, you'd be like, wow, he'd have to like skip using DRM in order to do that, and that would be true. However, since it's open source, you get all of that, and you're basically pretending that it's a commercial product so that I could pretend to live and eat food and live in a house and stuff like that. So it's a pretty good arrangement. Our imaginations can run wild with this one. And kind of already have, because here I am. The previous one that I put out was DeRez, and that was a year ago, something like that. It was a little while ago. And our collective imaginations have left me doing all of this so hard that here I am with the new one that didn't exist before last week or so. And as you can see, it's got all kinds of crazy wonderfulness to it. So if you like me being able to do this, you know what to do. And if you don't like me being able to do this, because I have seen some people disliking me doing stuff that mangles the sound too much, terribly sorry. This mangles the sound a lot, and that's just the way I like it. So you're going to have to live with that one. On that note, I will say thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed DeRez2, and I'll talk to you later.